But after that, in the last year or so, Turkey has been increasingly at the forefront of international coalition to change the regime. In that sense, Turkey's relationship with both Russia and Iran were also severed. So in that sense, Turkey's policy of trying to support the opposition also came with significant regional repercussions because it had to sever its relations with major neighbors. Both Russia and Iran are major suppliers of oil and gas to Turkey, so there are significant costs to Turkey for supporting the Syrian opposition. Here, before I move on to the second part of my question, I would like to add one observation about one point which was made by the previous speaker. This insistence on the unification of the opposition, why Turkey and Qatar acting that way, as far as I can tell, at least from the Turkish perspective, it's also an instrumental approach from the Turkish point of view. As far as I can tell, Turkey wants to unify the opposition on a political platform so that it could insist on the United States and the West to be more forthcoming. So one of the arguments used to justify the low degree of U.S. involvement was the fact that the opposition was disorganized. By trying to present a unified front, Turkey hopes to also press on the West to be more forthcoming. I guess this is the strategic rationale there. So the second part of my presentation, the implications of the Syrian case for Turkey's Middle East policies, Turkish foreign policy. To respond to that question, we have to first remember the main outlines, the main contours of Turkey's Middle East policy, what it was before the Arab Spring and how it has been affected by the Arab Spring and Syria case as well. I mean, I will not go into detail, but as far as I can tell, when we talk about Turkish foreign policy before the Arab Spring, we always talk about proactivism, especially in 2008, 9, 10. In Washington, in many European capitals, the discussion was about proactive Turkish foreign policy. Sometimes people call it neo-Ottomanism, sometimes they called it zero problems with neighbors policy, but overall, in my own understanding, it was a regional policy, it was a neighborhood policy. Turkey was trying to create a belt of stability and prosperity in its southern borders through proactive involvement. So in that sense, it was an effort to create a regional order in the Middle East, centered, hopefully, around Turkey. Turkey will be in a central position to shape the developments. So in that sense, the Middle East policy of Turkey prior to the Arab Spring foresaw that Turkey would be at the center, would be in a position to develop autonomous, independent policies to shape the events in the region. Secondly, it would also involve regional solutions. Regional actors will get together and develop solutions to their own problems rather than the external international actors. And thirdly, Turkey's Middle East policy was based on what I call liberal foreign policy instruments. Turkey was especially using economic interdependence, soft power, diplomacy, mediation, engagement policy to penetrate into the Middle East. It was very much based on a liberal approach to international relations, especially this notion of zero problems with neighbors was reflective of the fact that Turkey was operating in its Middle East policy from a liberal understanding. So in that sense, the Arab Spring, the Syrian case, was a major test for Turkey's Middle East policy. It presented many challenges, and it led to major revisions along the way. As far as I can tell, at least there are several major revisions, but the first one, Turkey realized the limits to its power, its ability to develop autonomous policies was severely tested. In some cases, Turkey was able to get what it wanted, but in many other cases, especially in Syria, as I mentioned earlier, initially Turkey tried to find a solution through its own engagement policy with Assad, but it did not work. So in a sense, Turkey realized the limits to its own power. Also, the limits of the regional solutions paradigm was also revealed, especially Turkey initially ideally would have loved to see a solution that would come through a dialogue between Turkey, Iran, and perhaps other regional actors, not the involvement of the Western countries, the international powers. But that didn't work. The Arab League plan did not really produce much solution. And in that sense, Turkey had to work with the international actors. So in that sense, in 2010, everybody here in Washington were talking about axis shift. Turkey was deviating away from the West, but now in the context of the Arab Spring, we see Turkey is coordinating, recalibrating its relationship with the West and the United States. There is this transformation, major transformation in Turkey's foreign policy. Also, the liberal foreign policy instruments were also tested. Prior to the Arab Spring, Turkey always used to talk about soft power, engagement, diplomacy, dialogue, but after the Arab Spring, with the transformations in Syria, we see increasingly the hard security issues, military power, border skirmishes with Syria, deployment of Patriot batteries, and early missile shield raiders, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, the hard power is on the agenda of Turkish foreign policy, which we can debate, and the domestic implications. Do I have another minute?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Domestic implications. At the beginning of the crisis, Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan said something like, Syria is an internal issue for us. This was a very important statement. He still insists on the same statement as far as I can tell. It creates enormous debate in Turkish domestic politics as well. Why the leader of Turkey sees Syria as an internal matter? As far as I can tell, first it was because of this positive identification with the Arab Spring of the ruling elite in Turkey. It could be an ideological, but also it is because the Turkish elite sees the transformation of the Middle East and the transformation of the Turkish society as part of the same historic trajectory. So in that sense, there is this positive identification, but also the security implications. What happens in Syria directly has implications for Turkish security as well. It is because of the future of the Syrian Kurds, it is because of the movement of refugees, it is because of the sectarian dimension as well. So in that sense, the sectarian element in the Syrian conflict may have some ramifications for Turkey's own domestic policies as well. This is one of the things which sometimes comes up in Turkish domestic discussions. So in that sense, Turkish government has to act very carefully so that the sectarian element in the Syrian conflict will not spread to the Turkish domestic context. And this, I guess, explains why Turkey has taken a very proactive position on Syrian conflict, because of those direct security risks, possible linkages. Turkey was trying to avert the escalation of the crisis into a civil war of sorts early on. That's why Turkey has been always urging the United States to be more forthcoming, more proactive. Another way the Syrian conflict has been incorporated into Turkish domestic politics is the following. Increasingly, the domestic political discussions are centered on foreign policy issues in Turkey. It's a very interesting case. Sometimes the foreign policy positions of the government become more important than bread and butter issues domestically. And for instance, a couple of weeks back, there was a motion in the parliament, vote of confidence against the foreign minister because of his Syria policy, especially given the current constellation of powers in Turkish domestic politics. Very much the opposition wants to capitalize on Turkey's Syria policy, presenting it as a failure to weaken the government. So again, we see domestic politics also is intermingled with foreign policy. We could come back to that in the Q&A session.
I'm sure there'll be many questions about Turkey's position on this. Thank you very much, Shaban Kardas. And now a bit further afield to the west of Syria, we have Iran. Geneive Abdo will be enlightening us about Iran's position and how far will Iran go to defend their ally in Damascus.
Hello, good afternoon. Yes, I've been assigned a somewhat daunting task, but I will try to present the view from Tehran on various levels. But I'd like to first go back to the beginning of the Arab uprisings in 2011, just to try to give you some sense of where Iran viewed its role in the region then compared to now. At that time, Iran was in a very good strategic position if you consider the government in Iraq, if you consider its relationship with Turkey, and also domestically at home, Iran was very successful in crushing completely an uprising against the regime which had occurred in 2009 and 2010. So in the view of Ayatollah Khamenei, when the uprising began, He felt this was Iran's moment, that the Arab world would finally offer Iran the opportunity to become this regional power, superpower, that Iran had been sort of attempting to create in the region since the 1979 revolution. And I will just read you briefly some of the words that Khomeini said at the time. He characterized the uprisings as an Islamic awakening, and this was in February 2011, and in March, a month later, he went further to say that all regional uprisings will be in Iran's favor because Iran does not make any sectarian distinction between Sunnis and Shias. He said, we do not that this is an Islamic awakening. We do not distinguish between Gaza, Palestine, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Bahrain, and Yemen. We have supported Palestine for 32 years, and they are not Shia. It is a protest, he said, of nationalism against oppression. So this is how he viewed the uprisings as a great moment for Iran. Now, here we are 2 years later, after the uprisings have begun, and the benefits for Iran are clearly more limited and much more complicated than Khamenei ever envisioned. We also see that we have endured almost 8 years now of an Ahmadinejad presidency in which he also made as his priority Iran's being a hegemon in the region. So we have seen not only a disappointment for the supreme leader, but also for Khamenei. And Syria in particular, of course, is the most severe blow to Iran. And the catastrophe for Iran and Syria comes in a different context than we saw 2 years ago. We have, as was discussed in great detail in the previous panel, we have Iran, which is now increasingly isolated by Gulf states. Since the uprisings began, I've made several trips to Bahrain, and even the Shia in Bahrain who are leading the uprising, that Iran thought they could count upon to look to Iran for support, is trying in a very deliberate way to distance itself from being perceived as having any sort of support from Iran or being seen as being any sort of client of Iran, despite all the efforts that the Saudis and other Gulf states are trying to make exactly the opposite argument. So the blow to Iran due to the Syrian conflict is really has two major aspects. One, of course, is that the Iran-Syria bilateral relationship has been Iran's most important partnership in economic, military, and diplomatic cooperation. The military aspects of the relationship now are key to Assad remaining in power and key to Iran having its continued access to Syria and to the arms flow to Hezbollah. Even if Assad's regime survives, however, the relationship is changed for good. So Iran sees this as the time for opportunity, the years that have existed the years that Iran has existed in a very successful Hezbollah, Syria, Iran axis, those years are over, and the regime knows that. In addition, Iran had thought that in the case of an attack by Israel, it could count on Hezbollah and Syria if it were attacked. That is no longer the case. Syria, of course, is in absolutely no position to help the Islamic Republic. And for Hezbollah, it's far too politically costly in Lebanon to come to the rescue of Iran, given the Syrian conflict. The second reason that the Syrian conflict is most costly to Iran is Iran's is seeing that it's diminishing religious authority and influence in the region. The sectarian war has created a narrative between Shia and Sunni in the region in which sectarianism is becoming pronounced in countries such as Lebanon, where it's quite pronounced in Lebanon, in the Gulf states, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar. It's reached the point that it's not only the more fringe Salafist movements who are talking about their great animosity toward the Shia, but we also have the warnings from influential sheikhs such as Yusuf Qaradawi in Doha, warning of the Shiaization of the Middle East.